This episode may contain stories of domestic violence. Please be advised. Welcome to the Sage Advice Podcast, where each week we sit down with people just like you who have left abusive relationships and found healing. Don't forget to check out our website, sage.community, because together we can survive abuse with grace and empathy. Now sit back and get comfortable. The Sage Advice Podcast starts right now. Hey there. Welcome to this week's episode of the Sage Advice Podcast. This is Erin, and I am so excited to be back for some new episodes. Today, I am welcoming Rev Amelie Wilmer. She is the rector of St. John's Episcopal Church here in Richmond. And I asked Rev Wilmer to come on the show today because, as we're talking about different ways to find healing in the Sage community, for a lot of people, the church and Christianity is a big part of healing. And so I wanted to make sure we talk about that. But I also know that this can be a very difficult topic for many who have been hurt by the church or hurt by members of the clergy. A lot of people have been judged, criticized, and most importantly, for our purposes today, there are a lot of people who've been encouraged to stay in abusive relationships by the church because that's what leaders felt was God's way. And for the record, going forward, when I say church, I'm not just talking about this Amelie's particular church or your Christianity in general. It's just a broad sense of all different types of religion. So a few months ago, I reached out to Rev Wilmer because I wanted to tackle this complicated issue, but I wanted it to be with the right person. Rev Wilmer leads a support group for women leaving abusive relationships at her church. She also has an undergraduate degree from Yale University, a postgraduate degree from Virginia Theological Seminary, and a master's in Divinity from Union Presbyterian Seminary. So she's very educated on this issue, and I think she is the perfect person to help us walk through this very complicated topic. So without further ado, please help me welcome Rev Amelie Wilmer to the show. Thank you for being here today.
Honored to be here today. Thank you.
Of course. So first of all, I like to just ask a question to every guest. What brought you to advocating for this topic and creating your support group?
Lived experience of women, not only in the church, but in life in general. And I was part of the generation of women who wanted to break loose from the social norms of stay-at-home mom, raising the children, father the breadwinner, and some of the more abusive and condescending attitudes toward that role. So I went off to college in 1977, and I am woman, hear me roar, and I was going to do it the way the men did it because I could now do that. And I think along with a lot of other women in my generation, we were able to accomplish much, but we also had to run into a hurdle at every turn in the way. And we discovered, and I know I did, that rising in the career landscape that was formerly in the male domain was one aspect. But how then do you also be a wife and a mother and fit into the society that had really depended on that mother? And so I really became interested in not really the cost, but the price of motherhood and the really difficult time we had and continue to have with the roles of women. And especially since I did maintain my life of faith throughout that time, left, went away, came back, and felt very stifled by certain parts of the Bible that were used to keep us. The mother should be in the home. The woman's role is just to be a supportive. and be a subservient, and taking on the mind of Christ meant suffering to follow Christ. Those parts of the Bible were parts I want to take my little scissors and snip out. And rather than reject it all, I lean back into it, because my feeling was that there was so much goodness and truth and love in these ancient texts, but there was so much interpretive clutter and litter in them too. So I wanted to stay and try to transform it from the inside versus throw rocks at it from the outside. And that was a lot easier said than done. But I stuck with it. And not only as just a regular lay parishioner, joining Bible study groups, women's groups, I did a lot of work in the nonprofit community to help women work on their way from the welfare to work. I had times when I was going into some of our inner city communities and sitting on the floor with other women, talking about parenting issues, about some of the projections that were placed on them. So I just had a heart for that. I also ended up going through my first husband ended up leaving the marriage, and I raised 3 sons on my own. So I had done a lot of thought about this from the perspective of someone who might have more privilege and others who have less privilege. So I know I'm rambling on about this. It's no clear-cut answer. I was in the corporate world in banking in New York. I was in the nonprofit world in Richmond. I've been in church communities from Los Angeles to New Haven, Connecticut, to downtown Richmond. So I have seen a lot of different elements of the role of women, and now much more work on women of color. So anyway, I'll stop there and let you answer the next question.
No. I wanted to follow along that line and get people to get to know you a little bit, because I find your past, just on your bio that you sent me, so fascinating. And so you grew up in Los Angeles, right? Okay.
My parents were transplants from the East Coast. They both left their old families, met each other out there, had children very young. And I was raised right next to UCLA in Westwood. And I grew up right alongside the Vietnam War era. Mm-hmm. And, on the UCLA campus was right down the street from my junior high, and the protests and the sort of hippie era, the anti-war era, and then the emerging women's liberation movement after the civil rights movement.
So you're kind of just around all of this while you're in middle school at a young age.
Very formative.
Yeah, I can imagine. Absolutely. And so then you go to Yale, and you had how many degrees at Yale?
I danced around for a long time, and I after a few tries at pre-med and then maybe American studies, I landed with economics and political science, which was a combined major. That there was a school of thought that understood the two as inseparable from one another.
Okay.
And then also my love was history of art. And I took so many courses in it that my advisor suggested maybe I major in that too. And at Yale, there were no major and minor. You just had two majors.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I wrote my 2 theses, and I somehow managed to use those in very unusual ways. But yes, so I was an art history major and economics and political science major.
Right. And then, so it says that after that, you went to New York City. Were you working on Wall Street?
I was working, I was trained on Wall Street in commercial banking. And then I ended up working for Chemical Bank of New York, which is now Morgan Guaranty, in their commercial real estate division. And I was assigned to Texas and Canadian real estate developers.
Okay. So I'm sure, tell me a little bit about that time frame in New York City as a young woman. I'm sure it informed a lot of your, your drive to help women, I would think, in the 70s.
It did. I mean, part of it was, I think the formation of an identity as a woman in business was something that was really in process then. But at least in New York, I had about 5 to 10 years of mentors.
Okay.
When I arrived.
People who'd already kind of broken the glass
there
ceiling.
was this idea that you wore your pinstripe suit and your bow tie and you were tough cookie. You put up with it. If someone made a sexist remark, you just let it go over your head. You didn't let that get in the way because we were struggling to make it.
Right.
And we had to be flawless.
Perfection.
Oh, perfection. Because any excuse, she's a woman, she's emotional, she's scatterbrained. I mean, all these characteristics that were looming in the crop. And there was a lot of tension because there were men working with us and their wives were at home taking care of the children, and they valued that. Mm-hmm. And we were not. And there was tension between the women who were at home and the women who were not at home. And I myself had to transform my own understanding of that. So yes, it was exciting. It was challenging, but there were every week there was something. Mm-hmm. That today we would have gone to court over. Then you just put up with it. Right. So, and I saw some things there that I wish I had never seen.
I'm sure.
How women were treated.
What made you decide to get out of the finance world and out of New York?
Well, when I married my college sweetheart, who was from Richmond, Virginia, and I did not get out of the finance world there.
Okay.
I moved to Richmond, Virginia, with my New York banking background. I ended up working at first for a Virginia bank, and that was quite an experience as a woman. Women were just getting into business and banking in the South at that point. After a few years of struggling with a lot of sexist treatment, I was offered a position by a North Carolina bank to help run their Richmond office. And at that time, the North Carolina banks were far more progressive in their attitudes towards women. Mm-hmm. And it was a great opportunity. And I managed that office for 5 years here in Richmond. So my banking career extended for about 11 or 12 years.
Okay. And did you have your kids during that time?
My first son.
Okay.
Then after a few years, my husband, who was a lawyer, and I decided, I'll back up a little bit.
Okay.
I decided that I was one of the first women, some of my colleagues who were lawyers, to present a part-time position. Okay. So that I could spend more time with my child. And the bank agreed to it. It moved forward for 2 or 3 months. I still had a nanny. And after the third month, they told me they were closing the office.
Heartbreaking.
And it's other stories, but we've eliminated the position.
Yes.
This was 1992.
Okay.
So at that point, I did some consulting after that. And then my husband and I decided his income was at a place that I would stay home for a while. We would work on our family and then go back to work once they were a little bit older.
Okay.
And that's when I started getting involved in voluntary organizations and nonprofit work, and very much centered on the needs of family and children.
Very good. So you have a pretty extensive career with nonprofits. How long did you do that work for?
About 10 years.
About 10 years. Hey guys, it's Erin. I'm interrupting this episode real quick just to let you know to check out the website sage.community. We've got some great new meditation classes up and a lot more to come. We'll talk to you soon. And now back to the episode. Now, what made you decide, okay, now I'm done with this and I need to go to seminary?
Didn't happen that way.
Okay.
I had 10 years. In those 10-year period, I had 3 sons. My ex-husband left, and I went through a painful divorce, but decided to stay here in Richmond and raise them. And during those years, so much of my work was focused on the needs of family and children, education. We're working with children at Carver Elementary School in the inner city to get the tutoring and support they need, working with the mothers to get their GEDs, and prepare for their first job interview. So I was very connected that way. And then also over those years, leaning more and more into my spiritual journey and finding sources of support through my faith community that brought men and women together to recover, to be more fully who God had created them to be. And I was increasingly drawn to that, not only in my work with nonprofit groups, with small groups, but also within my church community, within my, women's groups I had outside of church. I mean, even my first quote unquote play group, all women who had started out in professional careers, all trying to raise their children, balancing all of that.
That's really great.
So I think when I after I got on the other side and settled into being a single parent, I was even more acutely tuned in to the need for support around those types of life changes.
Yeah, it takes a village.
Or what?
It takes a village. That's always true.
It really
right?
does. It really does. So I went through a 4-year program that I had hoped would help me make sense of some of the changes I'd experienced in light of my faith tradition. And I also had seen how faith had both helped and hindered the healing of many, many, both men and women. And I was interested in how I could bring the goodness that I saw into the hands and the hearts of more people. And so I have always had a very, very visceral negative reaction to sort of more fundamentalist, judgmental brands of religion.
Did you grow?
Make almost to a point where it makes me sick to my stomach.
Yes, I got a rude awakening when I moved from Wisconsin, the Midwest, to the South, because I grew up, my dad's family is Catholic. My mom is Protestant. We went to a congregational church, and it was very much positive love about your heart to God's heart, and your interpretation was the most important of what you felt and building that relationship. And the church helped you build that relationship. So I was never around, pastors or ministers that were extremely judgmental. And when I came to the South, I got hit in the face real hard with that. Somebody, I think the first week started an argument with me that, Catholic people weren't Christian. And I took that very personally, considering I just look at my grandmother and the rest of my family are some of the best people I've ever met, and to this day. And so I understand what you're saying. It's hard to reconcile that. It took me a long time to find a church that I even liked going to down here. And so that's why when I came to St. John's, when I lived down the street, it really resonated with me. I always say it's a really formal service. I don't think that it's changed much in 200 years, but it's really an open, loving place. And that's what I think church should be. And so I'm very happy that they have such an open, caring, loving pastor, because that's what I think religion should be.
Thank you. And I feel that I grew up in the Episcopal Church.
Okay.
And my mother was Catholic, my father was Episcopalian, but his family sort of won the prize on where I was baptized. And I just took it for granted that it was a church that assumed that you were first loved, first sinful.
Yeah.
First loved, beloved. You might stray from that. You might turn away from it. You might reject it, but you're always created first perfectly. And in
with love in mind, and love is the intention.
Not you're first a sinner, and unless you do X, Y, Z, you will not be received into the arms of God. They're two very different approaches to the quote unquote gospel.
Right.
You are first a sinner doesn't sound like gospel to me, but some people it does. I have to say that it just does. So I find that I have walked alongside those who were taught that form of Christianity to bring them to another, because many people don't want to let go of it. Harmed them, but they don't want to let go of it.
Right.
So how can we find another way of understanding it that's equally biblical, if not more so? So I feel like that's, so when I grew up in that church, I went off my own way in my 20s, did my own thing. And I came back to it and I'm like, oh, well, I'm kind of glad I did grow up here.
Right.
Has been probably one of the more progressive churches when it's come to the ordination of women, the inclusion of gay and lesbian clergy, the support of same-sex marriage, civil rights activism, social justice. It wasn't always that way, but I would say it really got its act together after the civil rights movement. So I would say this is a more progressive. Ironically, the old denominations like Lutheranism and they tend to be more progressive now.
Which I find very interesting. As I said, I usually fall asleep at church, and you would think that the rock band, style is progressive, but that's really not the case a lot of the time. And so we talked a little bit before about the different scriptures that you think you mentioned are misinterpreted or mistranslated that people use to, put others down or keep people in relationships. So why don't you talk a little bit about, what you've seen and the different scriptures that are used kind of incorrectly or in a negative way?
So I'll preface that by saying one of the things that drew me to seminary and kept me there and has stayed with me is the rise of feminist biblical scholarship. Very helpful, and it hasn't just been women; it's been men as well. And there has been a lot written about the rhetoric of sexuality in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian scriptures, even the Adam and Eve story. And I would highly recommend an author, Phyllis Tribble, who wrote a book, God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality. So I'll kind of leave it at that.
Okay.
One of the texts that has often been used to support domestic abuse has been the book First Peter, the letter.
Okay.
And it's the one that says wives should obey their husband, put on the mind of Christ. You should suffer as Christ suffered. And I can't, it's very sad to see how often some of the verses from that letter are used to tell Christian women that they should stay in an abusive relationship. And there are documented studies, and I can provide you with some of that information, how often that still exists. So what I have done is I always take the approach of what was going on in the society and what were the cultural norms of the time.
To contextualize it.
And contextualize it, absolutely. And the Roman Empire was a patrilineal, very structured, well-organized society to maintain order. The emperor was at the head. It was all based on the natural law of things. And the male was the head of the household. The slaves, the wives were property. And it kept order.
Okay.
It made things work. There's also some ideas of the women's physiology, that she was, quote unquote, more porous, more subject to emotional fluctuations. She was more likely to be deceitful, facetious, there were a lot of ideas about a woman's physiology that contributed to that.
Okay.
So written probably near the end of the first century, maybe even the early second century, and Christianity was infiltrating the Roman Empire. And in order for it to survive, it needed to conform. So the message was, especially with women who had converted to Christianity in a pagan home, don't make waves.
Okay.
Same with slaves, don't make waves.
So I never thought of it that way, that it depends on the society that, this original pure form of Christianity was brought to, and then society made changes based on their ways of life.
And I think what they would do, you take the best social norms of a society and you want to model Christianity to support those. But when the social norms change, Christianity needs to support those. And when science changes, and so just to kind of take a step back, there's a way of understanding Scripture as being prescriptive. In other words, these behaviors prescribe how you're supposed to act, or descriptive. They describe the society in which they were formed.
Okay.
And so these original texts and orderings of human society weren't necessarily to prescribe how society should be ordered 2,000 years later.
Right. It's more describing what's going on right now in the present.
Right. How you deal with that present reality. And so what, other teachings of Jesus are things like, I have many things to tell you, but you aren't ready to hear them yet. Which shall be revealed. So TSL is you can only handle so much reality. So if you think about all the changes that have been made since the first century and our understanding of human physiology, government, human freedom, science, the earth is not the center of the universe, but the Bible's.
Right. But that, again, it was at the time and that particular culture, the living document.
So I think what we do is we pick and choose sometimes the things that we want from the Bible to be prescriptive, just descriptive of an old way of life.
Right.
Some people who are maybe more fundamentalist who will say, the Bible says this is the way society should be ordered. They're not also reading Leviticus and thinking that certain kinds of linen shouldn't be next to flax.
Yeah.
Or some of the dietary or purity codes. So you just have to say some things were made to keep society ordered, and they worked then. They were also imposed upon these new converts to Christianity. These new converts to Christianity didn't create those norms. Those are the norms that were given.
All right.
So then do we as Christians now reproduce those norms that were imposed upon the early Christians, who were also told, let's say in Paul's letter to the Galatians, that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. Also know that Jesus had women following him around. They were his constant companions, and the first of his followers to announce that he was resurrected was a woman. And so those early women followers of Jesus probably got a lot of attention and probably contributed to some of the persecution of those early Christians. So I'm going off on a lot. There's much more to say about this. So I just feel like there are a lot of things that need to be corrected and reinterpreted with really good scholarship of the context and other writings from the Roman Empire, other philosophies, histories, so that we have a better understanding of these people.
So when you work with people who have been or have seen Christianity as, I'm the sinner first, love doesn't come first, and they maybe have been in a domestic violence situation, how do you work through that with them, either in the group or one-on-one?
Well, the first is to invite those who have had that experience to come forward. Now, just to share with you, the idea for the group, it's now called the Transformation Group.
Nice. I like that title.
It used to be a survivors group, and then it was Transformation and Recovery Group, and now they want there just to be a Transformation Group. And there's a description of it so that people who have suffered from abuse say, oh, this is a thing, but it's not just centered around your identity as an abused person.
Right. That's only a small part of who you are.
Right. There's a woman in my congregation who had suffered sexual abuse from her father. And she was very interested in helping others. She had, through her faith, through a support group, received healing. Her go-to literature was a little more evangelical than the more progressive literature that we use. And so I tried to find material that would be more suited for our congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked about it for a while. We put a blurb in the bulletin, and there were about 5 who came, and we started, we shared, and we picked a book by a theologian, counselor, scholar named Wayne Muller, entitled "How Then Shall We Live?"
I have to write that down.
And he had worked with a lot of abused populations in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a lot of Native American communities, women who had suffered trauma and abuse, and had spent years and years with storytelling, sharing, getting deep down. And he walked alongside them in the process of healing, and he began to notice that with all the different therapies we have, they identified with the thing they were healing from.
Say that one more time. You cut out a little bit at the beginning, and I want to make sure people hear that point.
They became identified with the thing they were healing from.
That happens. It really does. I think, the word or the phrase, battered woman really bothers me. I just think it's so little and non-existent for a lot of people. And it makes you feel weak when most people I know who have been through this and come out the other side are incredibly strong and powerful. And that's only a tiny part of what happened to them in their lives. And so I could see how that would be, you identify with what happened instead of transcending into something else.
So the process needs to be longer life than that.
Right.
And just naming the wound and identifying with it. So he looked at people who were able to move on, and he said, rather than focus on the next step is to find out, what you love. Who do you want to be? How then shall we live?
Right.
And learning to really lean in to what you love and how you are loved, and focus your energy, focus your attention on that. And so with this group, we did the story sharing and the telling and formed the trust and the safety, and then became the work of transformation. And some of the women who have been farther along on the road to transformation were able to really be mentors and support for those who hadn't been. But the dynamic shift, because it's an ongoing process. You may feel like you've way grown up, and then something in life hits you and you're way back into some, old shame or old pain. So it's not like it's a linear process, and you know that. We all know.
And that's exactly what my guidance and my vision was for the workshops, just in a virtual setting. So hopefully they can reach more people and, go through sharing and building that bond, but then understanding what you went through a little bit better so that you can move on and start to see a vision of the future that you want to live in, and start healing faster. Maybe not faster, but more completely, I guess.
Yeah, and just like if you can find some bit of wisdom that will help you accelerate your process, you will. Although, at the time, healing takes time.
Yeah.
So we would also pick a book of the Bible. Like the book of Ruth is a beautiful story of women walking alongside women who'd had their lives taken apart, rug pulled out, unconventional relationship, picking each other up by the bootstraps, making life work, rolling up their sleeves, pushing each other to go the extra yard, and so we would find biblical grounding for that strength that we were all seeking, and texts that don't offer the judgment part of empowerment part. And I think that it's all there. You can find all about what you're paying attention to.
Yeah, I think, if you are somebody who, is interested in renewing your faith and, believing that God is not about sin, but about love, I think that's a great message, that there are empowering scriptures. There are empowering ways to see things. But you can do some reading on your own instead of getting advice from some other people. So we're actually close to end of time, if you can believe it. This has been a very fascinating conversation. What would be the biggest piece of advice you have for somebody who's lost, has, maybe just left a relationship, trying to figure out how to heal?
Find your people. Don't do it alone. You may start reading. Find your people who reflect the best of you, who are really accurate mirrors for who you are. And you may not be able to have that every day, but make sure you put those really loving, affirming, life-giving people in your life who are that will reflect back to you your goodness.
I love that. Thank you so much for coming, Reverend Wilmer. I would really appreciate it. I know everyone listening does too. And some of the books that you mentioned, or some of the, scholarly articles, we'll definitely put some links up to, so that anyone who's interested can find them more easily. Thanks everybody for listening. And if you want to find your people, come on our social media page at @Our Sage Community on Facebook and Instagram. And we will talk to you next week. Thanks, everyone. Well, that's our show. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, or if you're willing to share your story, please email us at sageadvicepodcast@gmail.com. Until next week, remember, when you're kind to yourself, the healing can begin. See you next time.
This show was brought to you by inflowradio.com, the best curated talk radio network for personal development, wellness, spirituality, and conscious business.
If you or someone you love is in immediate danger, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-7233. For more information, please see the resources tab at sage.community.